Good morning, everyone. We are just waiting a minute or two until more people join.
Hello, Nick. How you doing?
Good to see you.
How are you?
Pretty good. Pretty good. You too?
Yes, good.
And hi, Federica.
What's that?
Oh, I was just saying hello to Federica too.
Hi, Nick. Hi, Adam. Hi.
Hi, Federica.
Hi, everybody.
For those of you that just joined, we're just waiting a minute as more people are joining this morning. Ciao, Serena.
Sorry for close my camera, but I am not at home and there is a big mess around me. It's not a good idea to open it. I'm happy to stay and here.
This is such a nice reunion of early modernists. It's a wonderful crowd. Okay, so why don't we get started? And again, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon to those of you that are outside of the US. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to welcome Adam Teller, Nicholas Terpstra, and all of you to this last event of our spring semester. It's so nice to see so many of you on this Zoom call, and I know that many more are joining this morning. If this is your first time attending an event of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center, I will be putting our email in the chat box momentarily if you'd like to join our mailing list to be informed about upcoming programs in the fall. And you can also follow us on Facebook. Today's program will feature a conversation between Professors Adam Teller and Nick Terpstra about Adam's groundbreaking recent book, Rescue the Surviving Souls. I want to mention that Princeton University Press is also offering a generous 30% discount on the book until the end of July. And I'm going to post the code in the chat again momentarily if you'd like to buy directly from Princeton. Let me give you some information about the format, although by now, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with our Zoom events. We are going to start with a brief introduction by Professor Teller, which is going to be followed by a very rich conversation between him and Nicholas Terpstra. And towards the end of the program, there will be also an opportunity for questions from the audience. If you have a question, since there is a fairly large group today, so please type your question in the chat box and I'll read it in the order that we receive. The event is being recorded, so if you have any questions about privacy, please feel free to keep your camera off. And later on, we're going to also upload it to the center's YouTube channel. And just as a reminder, please keep your microphones muted throughout the event. So let me turn to introduce our two speakers today who are experts on the early modern refugee problem. And I'm so looking forward to your presentation and your conversation. Adam Teller is professor of history and Judaic studies at Brown University. He's an early modern historian specializing in the history of the Jews in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and focuses especially on the ways in which they became an integral part of society there and the tensions that this aroused. He has written two monographs in Hebrew, one on the living conditions in the Jewish quarter of Poznan, the other on the roles played by Jews in Lithuania's 18th century magnate economy. A revised and updated version of this book has appeared in English as Money, Power, and Influence in 18th century Lithuania, the Jews of the Radziwiłł Estates, which appeared for Stanford in 2016. Adam is also the co-editor of several volumes, including most recently Purchasing Power, The Economics of Modern Jewish History, and the author of many path-breaking articles. Nicholas Terpstra is professor of history at the University of Toronto. His research investigates the intersection of politics, religion, gender, and charity in Renaissance Italy, with a particular focus on Bologna and Florence, and now Livorno and Siena as well. His most recent work is focused on early modern refugees and digital mapping. He is the editor of numerous volumes and the author of groundbreaking books in early modern Italian history, including Lay Confraternities and Civic Religion in Renaissance Bologna, which was awarded the Marraro Prize of the Society for Italian Historical Studies, Abandoned Children of the Italian Renaissance, Orphan Care in Florence and Bologna, Lost Girls, Sex and Death in Renaissance Florence, and Cultures of Charity, Women, Politics, and the Reform of Poor Relief in Renaissance Italy. And his most recent monograph is Religious Refugees in the Early Modern World, an Alternative History of the Reformation. So without further ado, Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and the Center for Jewish Studies. It's a real pleasure to be here. What I thought I'd do is just give a brief introduction to what the book's actually about as a background to my conversation with Professor Terpstra. So without further ado, I think I'll just jump straight into that. So the key event that triggered the refugee crisis I'm looking at was a wave of anti-Polish violence in 1648 in Ukraine, which was at that stage part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Jews got caught up in this violence since they were economic agents of the Polish Polonized nobility in Ukraine. And so in Jewish history, what happened in 1648 is registered as one of the major and most important attacks on Jewish life in Europe in general. And for Eastern European Jews, it was the archetypal attack until the Holocaust, when obviously things changed. Research has shown that possibly as much as a third of the Jewish population of Ukraine died during that violence. That was not the end of the violence, however. As the Ukrainian uprising came to an end in 1654, two other major powers of Central Eastern Europe, Russia and Sweden, decided that Poland was weak enough that they might be able to invade and take parts of it. So we have two other wars, one, the Russians invading from the east, and the other, the Swedes invading from the north. The Swedish war continues until 1660, the Russian war till 1667. Jewish historiography has really focused in on the first of these, the archetypal violence against Jews, which is the 1648 Khmelnytsky uprising, which is known in Jewish historiography as Gezerot Tachvatat, the disasters of 1648-9. And following on a traditional Jewish approach to disaster has been very martyrological in its approach, working really to a very great extent on the dead, the numbers of dead, memorialization of the dead, and so on. I began to think about this following a really interesting article by an Israeli scholar called Israel Halperin, who noticed that there was, in addition to all the murder, a certain amount of human trafficking of Jews from Ukraine to Istanbul. Part of the uprising, part of the violence was done by Tatars from the Crimea who made their living from slaving. And in 1648, they enslaved Jews and took them to Istanbul where they were sold. Halperin, following a 19th century scholar called Kaufmann, sort of started to look at this and wrote an article with about 7 or 8 pages on this. And I decided, working at that stage as part of an economic history working group, it would be a good idea to go back and re-examine this and try to understand in more depth the economic aspects, which Halperin was not really interested in. Within a very short time, however, I realized that what I was looking at was much, much broader than I'd expected. The more I looked, the more I discovered that the events following 1648, right, reverberated not just within Poland, although they reverberated very strongly within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but the Holy Roman Empire, Amsterdam, the Ottoman Empire and Italy were all deeply engaged in dealing with the problems that arose following the violence in Ukraine and the subsequent wars in Eastern Europe. In fact, places as far apart as Iran in the east, and even one of my refugees got to North America in the west, Hamburg in the north, and the whole of the Mediterranean basin, Cairo, perhaps as a southern marker. And in each of these places, what happened, the ways that dealing with the Polish Jews in the period from about 1648 to about 1660, perhaps a bit afterwards, in each of these places, right, this moment, right, is registered as a key part of the history, although nobody had ever tried to put all these mentions together to understand the phenomenon, not in its, particularly in its local treatment, but in fact as a general, more global phenomenon. So I sort of fell into this by starting to look at place after place and realizing just how rich the material was. So in the end, I decided I was going to write a book about refugees, and what I really wanted to do was to look at refugees as a human phenomenon. My gut feeling, and I still feel it very strongly, is that if you want to understand refugees and refugee crises, you have to understand it as an individual phenomenon. It is an aggregate of lots and lots of individual experiences. And if you just look at the sort of the broad picture, the numbers and so on, you just miss so much of what was going on. And I was fortunate in having quite a large number, in fact, a relatively very large number of documents, personal sources that allowed me to understand what was going on an individual level. And so I traced my refugees fleeing westwards to the Holy Roman Empire and Amsterdam. I traced them being taken as captives to Istanbul and there ransomed and either returning home or staying in the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean basin. And I also studied those refugees who actually just fled to different parts of Poland and Lithuania, stayed in Eastern Europe. So the book covers three major regions: Eastern Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Once I started looking at that, another key phenomenon really came to the fore, and that was the way in which the Jewish world not just dealt with the refugees where they were, but that in fact there were systems of philanthropic cooperation, right, which didn't appear in 1648. They were already there in 1648, but 1648 galvanized them, made the connections between them much tighter, gave them a sense of purpose, so that you can see fundraising particularly for ransoming the Jews in Istanbul, right, spearheaded in Venice. Venice was the spearhead, covering much of northern Italy, but going to the Sephardic centers of Hamburg and Amsterdam, and touching the Ashkenazic centers of Frankfurt and Eastern Europe, all pulling together, right, for the single cause of ransoming the Jews in Istanbul. And suddenly you begin to see a picture of a Jewish world coalescing. Right? It's not coalesced. I mean, it hasn't coalesced. It's a long processes. But this seems to be a key opening moment where all these systems that had been in existence in one way or another previously begin to coalesce to a single system that will have influence on the way the Jewish world develops. Another aspect of the book I found really interesting was the meetings that happened by looking at individual stories. And by the way, some of my sources allow me to hear women's voices and to pull out strands of women's experience during the crisis, because it was very clearly a gendered, these were gendered experiences. Became very interested in seeing the interactions between Jews of different ethnic groups as they met. So, for example, Polish-Lithuanian Jews met Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire when they were being redeemed. And there are sources showing like that, the appearance of Ashkenazic Jews in Istanbul, for example, gave a boost to the publishing industry there and caused an interest in Ashkenazic thought, right, amongst the Jews of Istanbul. And in addition, the chronicle, one of the major chronicles of Jewish experience, Yevei Metzulah, was reprinted once in Salonika and once in Venice. And so obviously, right, was being sold and read throughout the Sephardic world of the Mediterranean. And we know that Shabtai Tzvi himself had actually read it. A whole different, really interesting moment of meeting was in the Holy Roman Empire, where you see German Jews and Polish Jews, right, who in principle shared the same religious background. They were both what we call Ashkenazic Jews. But in fact, the meeting between them was a meeting full of tension and cultural difference. Not major differences, but the minor differences between them made that meeting a very tense one. I have a wonderful Yiddish source which sort of describes those tensions in a satirical way. But the meeting of German and Polish Jews was very, very influential, both on the development of Jewish culture in general and on the development of German Jewish identity in particular, which starting in the 1650s really, and going on, defines itself to a very great extent against the image of the Jews from Eastern Europe. And the first of those meetings where that tension really blows up is following, say, what Tach v'Tach, which is another one of the kind of shadows that this refugee crisis sheds, you know, over subsequent years. Yeah, there are questions of migration and forced migration. The visits of the refugees to Germany started the major sort of migration from east to west, which characterized modern Jewish history. I mean, it's slightly more complicated than that, but this is the moment where that movement begins, where the balance of power culturally between Eastern Europe and Central Europe shifts. Whereas before 1648, Eastern Europe was clearly the cultural powerhouse of the Jewish world, particularly the Ashkenazic Jewish world. After the 1650s, that balance is shifting very strongly in favor of Germany, even though there are many more Jews in Eastern Europe. Another phenomenon that this moment created. Finally, Reconstruction. The Jews managed to overcome this traumatic moment of death, destruction, and flight really quite rapidly. In Eastern Europe, the Jews retain their power within the towns, or they renew it within a decade, possibly a decade and a half. And in fact, they end up in a somewhat better position than they'd been before 1648. And they renew their economic contacts with the nobility, with the magnates, and suddenly penetrate the Polish-Lithuanian economy even deeper. So some scholars have argued that this is a sign that what happened in 1648 was not such a significant phenomenon, which if you look at just barely at the numbers, it's a ridiculous argument. A third of the population is killed just in Ukraine, and that's without the refugees. So that's not what's happening. What's happening is that the Jews of Eastern Europe have developed systems that allow them to deal with this kind of crisis and the kind of trauma that comes in its wake. And I looked at economic, social, legal, spiritual, religious, and psychological aspects, and I sort of built a picture how the Jewish society was able to deal with this, to embrace the problems, to give them some kind of answer, right, which allowed the Jews to reposition themselves, right, as I say, even in a better position than they'd been beforehand. So this is a book both about a terrible moment of human suffering and destruction and death and flight and the refugee experience, but it's also the story of a remarkable period of overcoming that suffering. How the Jewish world was able to respond to that challenge. And so that's another really important part of the book. And that brings me to my very last point, which is sort of my hope for the book. Because what I've managed to do in this book is take one refugee crisis from the beginning to the end, from A to Z, and trace how it worked, how it played out, right? In a very broad, not quite global, but almost global setting. Forced migration studies today, particularly those dealing with contemporary situations, might struggle because to understand the phenomena very largely because they don't have much perspective. They are struggling, and quite rightly, with terrible things that are happening in our time, trying to understand them and make research that will help policy. So what I'm hoping is that I hope for the book is that by having a historical perspective, by presenting one refugee crisis from beginning to end, I can add a degree of perspective to the way forced migration and refugee studies works. It's a hope. I don't quite know. I'm quite doubtful it'll have a huge impact, but that is something I hope I can offer on a much broader stage than the one I've just been looking at. I think I'll stop there, and Nick, if you'd like to take the conversation on.
Sure, I'd love to. And it's an extraordinary book, Adam. Congratulations. It's sweeping in its scope and extraordinarily detailed in its depth. You've gone into a whole range of archives. I'd like to address a couple of the questions that you've opened up. I mean, some of the broader questions you've raised about the broader impact of the refugee experience, questions around trauma and all the rest. I think there's any number of ones that we can deal with, but maybe to get into it first, as you said, there's a lot of ego documents around this event. And one of the things that's the great joy of doing the kind of work we do is that you're working in the archives and you come across something that you never expected. And it's sometimes that little thing that opens up a whole series of doors. And it's sometimes hard to explain that to people afterwards. Once you put together your big picture, to explain that it actually began with this little letter that I found in a document somewhere. So I'd like to, before we get into some of the big questions, I'd like to take you, or have you take us into the archives. And was there a particular document that really stood out for you? Was there and it could have been anything, anywhere, but just maybe was there something that surprised you or led you down this because of because of what it contained, the richness of it?
There were a number of them. One of the richest and most interesting sources that sort of lit my imagination were depositions brought before rabbinical courts in the Ottoman Empire of Jewish women who had lost their husbands and they wanted to remarry, and in order to remarry they had to prove the death of their husbands according to a very high evidentiary bar which is set. And so there is in the archive, in the responsa literature, in the rabbinic court records of the Ottoman Empire, a whole range of depositions by men and by women, right, telling of their experience in Poland. And their goal is to talk about what happened to their husbands, but along the way, you get stories that allow you to understand moments of capture, loss of family. And one that comes to my mind, which sort of really made me think about issues of gender, is actually written by a man. It's written in the 60s, so he's a young man at that stage, and he tells a story that as a young boy, he'd been caught up in the massacres. The Tatars had come, they'd captured his mother and other women in order to send them to Istanbul. And he, as a part of the male part of the group, was going to be killed because the Tatars really wanted to deal in Jewish women. They took young Jewish men as well, but Jewish women were the prize. And he tells how his mother dressed him in a skirt, said I was, I was young. I didn't have a beard. My beard hadn't come through yet. So she dressed me in a skirt. She took me with her, and that's how I survived. And when I saw that, it suddenly, I got a real picture of what was going on the ground, what that meant for people, right? That was one wonderful. The other wonderful thing I think I found that really lit my imagination in terms of the psychological aspects is that one of the refugees in Eastern Europe had a personal diary, a sort of mystical diary, in which he wrote down a dream he had as a refugee. He'd fled from Ukraine to Krakow, and he had this dream about being trapped in a house trying to catch a dove, and that there are no doors and windows, and he's running around the house trying to catch the dove. And it was so meaningful to me in saying, well, there are psychological things going on here. This is a dream which is full of meaning, psychology. Of course, it's very hard to interpret. I struggled enormously to get to some interpretation. So that opened up for me this whole idea of the psychological aspects. And one last source I read, Introduction to a Rabbinic Text, this man writing in the 1710s, it must be, about how he, as a young boy, had fled from Uman in Ukraine with his family. He'd got to Belarus, and he says how he would sit on the roof in the evening with his Gemara, trying to learn Talmud, in floods of tears, banging his head against the wall, because he wanted, that his emotions were so strong, and his desire, right, to learn from to take from what he was learning, to learn about God, brought him to bang his head against the wall. And that to me spoke volumes about trauma. So those are the kind of things that gave it a real human thing. And once that was started, I began to search for more and more. And it turns out there are dozens upon dozens of very similar sources. That you go like a detective. It was great fun. It was a wonderful process. I really enjoyed it. I mean, it took forever, right? Because it's one piece after another. There is no block of archival sources. So I couldn't do that. I couldn't do what you like to do. You identify a block of sources, work through it. There's your monograph. I was doing it piece by piece, but it was absolutely wonderful. I'm sorry, I've gone on too long, Nick.
No, that's exactly. I think that what we're getting is the fascination and the path that leads you in, which is, I think, the kind of thing that draws us all in. Do you think it's this particular event that does it? I mean, what I'm trying to say is that, when there is a large number of ego documents, is it the event that generates them, or is it that people are becoming more expressive, are sharing it? Is it a result of the phenomena, or a result of the way changes in documentation are going?
And I think it's a little bit of both. This is a very intense phenomenon, like from beginning to end. It also raises lots of issues, new issues that really haven't been dealt with previously. And so that intensity undoubtedly spurs creativity. I mean, these ego documents can be very short, but really there wasn't a rabbi who fled Poland and ended up in Germany and wrote a book who didn't include in the introduction to his book his experiences. It was like major, and often in the most vivid and violent terms, like it's still alive in their minds. So that was one thing. Of course, we're also looking at the age of print. And so it's much easier to write these things down and have them printed. And in terms of depositions to rabbinical courts, those are also now published in collections of responsa. So it's a bit of both, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One thing that I think it was that you've dealt in a whole section on is precisely the enslavement of Jews and the redemption of Jews. And so this I think that it's a very timely thing, because we're being encouraged now, we're being challenged to really look at enslavement much more closely as part of the early modern experience and part of the early modern element around migration, but also the development of capitalism, gender relations, all the rest. I mean, what do you think this particular experience, this particular aspect of it shows us about some of those broader questions about enslavement? And is the Jewish experience here particularly helpul for us to understand what enslavement is like in the early modern world, because we so often think of, in terms of either the African slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, or sometimes the Mediterranean slave trade around piracy. But this seems to be something different again. And so, what does it show us? What does this episode show us about those larger questions around migration, capitalism, all the rest?
Yeah, well, I mean, first thing that it shows us, and so you've raised this already, but it's the question of the nature of slavery in the early modern period. We think of slavery in terms of Atlantic slavery as the paradigm, and we measure other kinds of slavery very often against that. But if you look at the sort of slaveries that I was looking at, the North African slavery, the Mediterranean slavery, and even more the Black Sea slavery, you're seeing two other slave systems at work at the same time as the development of Atlantic slavery. And until the first third of the 18th century, there's nothing to choose between them in terms of numbers. I mean, in the 18th century, the numbers crossing the Atlantic will grow exponentially and outnumber everything else. But until the first third of the 18th century, these are three different systems working in parallel. And the other thing that's really important about certainly the Mediterranean and the Black Sea slavery is, what are the factors at work? We're very used to thinking about slavery in terms of race, development of race, development of slavery. That's an Atlantic thing. But if you look at both the Mediterranean and the Black Sea slavery, you'll see that race, I mean, it's never not there, it's always there in some form, but it's not the determining factor. There are geopolitical and economic factors at work in both those places, which are driving slavery. There's a sort of also a religious element at work, although that too is not as dominant as you might expect. I think what you see in the Black Sea and in the Mediterranean is absolutely key in understanding early modern economic development in those regions, in the impact of slavery on the Mediterranean economy, and for that matter on the Southeastern European economy, was vast. For most of the 16th and 17th centuries, about 10,000 slaves were taken a year from Eastern Europe, around the Black Sea region, and sold as slaves. And it's no surprise that economic development in that region is very slow and difficult. If you think about what the impact that must have had. So that was the first thing I took out of this. That I needed to rethink what I meant by slavery. There are different kinds of slavery, by the way. The Mediterranean slavery is not a chattel slavery or plantation slavery. It's captive slavery, where people are taken as captives, as commodities. And if you could ransom them, that was the main goal. But if not, you could enslave, sell them as slaves, and use their labor. So that's a whole different kind of slavery. And ultimate slavery again, right? It's a whole different form of slavery, which really plays into the sort of the social fabric of the way the Ottoman society develops. So that's a whole nother aspect of it. Another thing that came out of this for me, I say less about race, but about religious culture, was really, I was interested in the way that the different groupings in the Mediterranean dealt with the question of ransoming the captives that were taken. So the story I tell is the story of Jews. And in Jewish religion, ransoming slaves, called in Hebrew pidyon shvuim, is a major religious imperative. Second, well, it depends who you ask, but it's, in the top three of the philanthropic imperatives of the Jewish world. And what the Jews did in order to fulfill this was to create long-range economic philanthropic networks by which money was funneled to Venice, which then dispersed it to deal with the problem of enslavement. This is less by Eastern European Jews, more pirates. But when the Eastern European Jews turned up in Istanbul, this caused a whole new issue that ransoming network was called upon to deal with. So that was how the Jews did it, by transregional philanthropic activities. The Christian world worked quite differently. It had ransoming orders, certainly in the Catholic Church, the Mercedarians, the Trinitarians, right? And it was their job to bring the money to ransom the slaves where they were found. That money was raised in the countries from which the slaves came. So that those orders in those places would have fundraising activities. A little bit later on, certainly also in Protestant countries, the state itself got involved with doing that. That was very much church funneled, very much sort of narrowly, regionally funneled, in order to raise the money. And then the church officials were those who basically did the ransom. The Islamic world, a whole different story again. As far as the Islamic world was concerned, the issue was not that of the captive slavery. The issue was much less of the slavery and much more of the captives. So that the Muslims who were enslaved, and many of them were, and were held in Europe, although Europe tends to think of itself as a slave-free zone, that was by no means the case. But wherever they were enslaved, they were treated like prisoners of war. And so it was done more or less ad hoc. The big systems that you see in the Jewish and the Christian world are not the way the Islamic world works. Right? They have a whole different system. Not that they don't ransom the people, because they do, but they have a whole different system. So once again, by looking at the Jews in the context of the Mediterranean, I was suddenly aware of the way in which these three cultural traditions, religious cultural traditions, dealt with the problem of slavery, which I found absolutely fascinating. One other thing about the Jews that's worth noting is that the Jews were enslaved. Not in this period, but in other periods, the Jews held slaves. Certainly we know in the Ottoman Empire, the Jews held slaves, and I think in Italy too. And the Jews were also slave traders. They worked as brokers. Very often they weren't allowed to actually be official traders. They needed a license and they couldn't get that. But they would broker deals and make a percentage. So it's a very interesting picture of the Jews sort of up to their necks in the slave business one way or another. And that once again suggests to me that the question of slavery is a very important factor in the development of early modern Jewish history that we don't really understand yet. And I've only just scratched the surface.
Well, and of early modern history generally, right? I mean, I think this is one of the things that we're realizing. It's something that that many Europeanists didn't want to really haven't wanted to deal with in any really intensive way, or simply shove it off, as you say, to an issue that has to do with the Atlantic slavery. What I was saying, what you're talking about there then is also the development of this international system, that there's an international response within the Jewish community, and that to some extent this 1648 Polish refugee crisis is, you've described it as the crisis that really creates in some ways this international Jewish community. Maybe a question I'd ask for, I can kind of understand the answer why, but maybe a question that might come from outside, people who aren't really familiar with the 1648, which, as you've said, is kind of dropped off the radar for many people. The question might be, why this crisis, and why not the Iberian refugee crisis, the Iberian Jewish refugee crisis of the 1490s, which many more people are aware of, certainly has great impacts. But does it create a similar kind of international network? Why do you focus on the 1648 one instead?
I think a lot has changed between the 1490s and the 1640s and 50s. It's not the same world, in Jewish terms, not the same world in European terms. And so in the 1490s, when the Jews flee across the Mediterranean to Italy, there is clearly a refugee crisis, and we do have sources dealing with refugee experience. But there aren't in place either the systems or, in fact, strong enough communities to work as hubs in order to make the systems work. neither in Italy nor in the Ottoman Empire are the Jews at a very inspiring moment in their development. The 16th century sees rapid and important development of communal institutions in both those places, or actually to some extent, of course, sparked by the arrival of the Sephardim. So I think it was a different world. The possibilities had changed. And if you think about it in terms of possibilities for travel, right? Traveling was a different experience in the 1650s and 60s than it was in the 1490s. Maritime technology, long distance travel was a whole different ballgame. Print, right? And the possibilities that print gave for connection, right? And creating the kind of connections that could be exploited, also absolutely key. One of the things I've looked at, I didn't put it in the book because it needs a lot more research, is the question of not newspapers, because Jewish newspapers don't really develop. Although we do actually see the Polish crisis reflected in non-Jewish newspapers in Europe. Here and there it appears, not much, but enough to be interesting. But in fact, in Yiddish, a kind of a new, an entirely new, almost new genre of literature develops called a historical song, which is in fact a chapbook telling about recent events, important recent events, and other texts too, suggesting that in that world of the 1650s, you could be interested in current events and get stories from much more distance. The book trade had created connections that could be exploited. So I think that's the key difference, that in both in terms of communications and in terms of the Jews' possibilities to exploit them, it was quite a different world. Which is why 1648, I think, is the moment of change, and not, I mean, 1492 is a huge moment of change for all kinds of different reasons, but from what I'm looking at, I think 1648 is a more important moment. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think in the book too, you talk about how much of the, say, the philanthropic networks are built in on merchant networks as well, that are much more broadly based and by the 17th century than they were in the late 15th. I understand we should open it up to a broader range of people, but I just wanted to ask one last question, and this is more, maybe we can muse on this together. We both looked at refugees in different contexts and the impact, and in a sense, the impact is in how we understand that nexus of religion and violence, and the way it both is kind of within communities and it affects communities, and sometimes they perpetuate them. So, as I've been looking at the refugee crisis, or the refugee phenomena within Catholic and Protestant Europe, it really is something that, to my mind, really shapes those communities in ways that the historiography has not entirely caught up with yet. That the elements of trauma there, the elements of identity, are things which we still have to incorporate, and that some of that comes out precisely from the comparisons across communities, and certainly Christians quite happily will, on the one hand, use the tropes of the Jewish Bible, of the Old Testament, to compare themselves to the Jews leaving Egypt, and yet they turn around and they will still be persecutors of Jews in their own communities. So there's an odd use by Christians of the Jewish experience. And it's as they're doing that, they're coming to a sense of who they are themselves as well. You've suggested that there's different kinds, out of the trauma of this experience, there's also changes within the Jewish community and the way Jews understand their own tradition and articulate it and express and share it. I guess what I'd ask, and this is more amusing, because so much of the historiography that we still deal with is a historiography that takes place in silos. How can we as historians learn from the experiences of other communities, and how can we work towards a more comparative understanding of the refugee experience in the early modern period? Because I think we're recognizing that it's profoundly influential in how those communities develop internally. Do you think there's a way that we can actually have dialogue that allows us to understand those experiences and how people may have understood them, how they understood other refugees in their own time?
I think I'd split that up into a number. into a number of different things. Historiographically, I think it's absolutely key that we should have a dialogue, because each of these phenomena illustrates a broader phenomenon, but in a very specific way. You can get to the universals through the specifics, and that I think is a very good way of working. At the time, both in terms of Jewish identity and in terms of the way the refugee crisis played out, the non-Jewish world was in the background, but never in the foreground. The part of the way in which early modern Jewish identity developed was you blocked out as far as you could. Certainly Eastern European Jews, they were geniuses at doing that. They could create a mental world in which there were no Christians at all, even though their whole economic life was to do with dealing with Christians. In their heads, they had their own, each town in Polish Jewish sources is never called a town, it's called a community. I'm going to the holy community of Krakow. Not I'm going to the town of Krakow, not important. So the Jews don't see the Christians. On the other hand, non-Jewish society does not see the refugees either, unless they cause a problem. Mm-hmm. If too many turn up in one town, in one place, there's likely to be a pushback, right? And then you have to get rid of them. But thinking of the Jews as refugees is very, very rare. There's one place I found really interesting in Silesia, where the Jews turned up from Great Poland, and they actually created their own refugee council and wrote to the emperor asking for help with paying taxes. But they're two separate worlds. And in fact, the Jews build on that. Right? They're transferring money across borders, right, with no, and they're moving with no supervision at all. And that's how they like it to be, I think. As I say, as far as working on the history and the importance of refugees is absolutely. The more we can integrate the different experiences, the better we're going to understand what they are and the early modern period in general. I don't know what you have to think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems that again, maybe the issue or the problem or the paradox, let's say, is more clear on the Christian side, where it's often the people who have been refugees themselves who, when they come into positions of power or return to positions of power, they quite readily create other refugees, and they will. So empathy is not necessarily something that's created out of the refugee experience, at least in the Christian world. Well, thanks very much. I want to cede it back to Francesca, because I'm sure there's quite a few questions, and it's been a real privilege to be having this conversation with you, and I look forward to it continuing with the other people in the group here. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you so much, Adam and Nick, for this very stimulating conversation. I am sure that many people have questions. I'm just gonna, as we're waiting for people to type their questions in the chat box, I'm gonna ask one. And I'm curious about your, I think, very deliberate intervention in Jewish historiography when it comes to taking a transnational approach to early modern Jewish history. We're coming out of a long period of studies that tended to focus more on the regional, on the local, and that was an important corrective, right? Swinging back from another long period of studies that were looking at larger themes and perhaps even generalizing with a great emphasis on Central Europe and the German lands. And so I'm curious how you see your contribution in light of this new trend, this new transregional, transnational trend in Jewish historiography, and how you're hoping that your book will move, right, the scales and moving forward.
Yeah, well, as you said, I mean, Jewish historiography, early modern, the last generation or possibly two, very influenced by the cultural turn, which posits that if you want to understand the Jewish culture and society in one place or another, you need to understand its interreactions with the larger society around it. Which is why Polish Jews were Polish, Italian Jews were Italian, French Jews were French, and so on. I've done that. I mean, my whole career until now has been built on doing that. So I'm not suggesting that that's not a very important thing to do. However, it misses a key aspect of the Jewish experience, which is to say that Jewish culture does not just develop in connection with its surroundings. It develops in connections with other Jewish centers with which the Jews in one place or another are in contact. And in the age of print, that is all the more so. And so absolutely, I really think that we need to take a step back from that kind of the localized cultural view. In modern history, people have sort of politically started looking at empires, but I'd go even broader than that. Right? And I mean, it has started. I'm not the first one to do this by any manner of means, but to look at the ways in which Jews far distant from each other are in contact, and even more so, what that contact means to the development of Jewish culture in both places. You know, hybridity famously, right? It's not just that the person being contact is influenced, all sides are influenced by those contacts. And that, I think, is really, you know, what I would hope would come out of my book in that way, that people would start to think, you know what, French Jews, what about, well, that's been done, I've been in North Africa, what about the connection between French Jews and German Jews? Paris, Berlin, whatever, I'm not, you know, and I think that's really important in the way we can think about the development of the Jewish world, not places in isolation from each other. As we thought, you know, history departments of universities love that. They love to keep, you know, I'm a historian of France, French Jewry, whatever. But we have to break those boundaries down. One thing I noticed in the research, which I found fascinating, and I think is important for understanding the early modern Jewish world, is that there was no center. There was not one place, you know, that was the center and it had its periphery. The world I'm looking at in the mid-17th century, certainly of the refugee story I'm telling, has four centers. There's the center in Eastern Europe, there's Amsterdam, there's Venice, and there's the Ottoman Empire, particularly Istanbul. None is more important than the others. People circulate between them in all different directions, and they're all in contact with each other. And that, I think, is really, really important in understanding the early modern Jewish world. That you cannot really look at it in isolation anymore. You're just missing a huge picture. As I say, I'm not the first one to say that by any manner of means, but I am, you know, I hope that this book will push that very strongly forward.
We have a question from Flora Casson. She's writing, I'm thinking of David Wack's work on the notion of double diaspora to explain how Sephardim understood themselves after the expulsion. Did the 1648 Ashkenazi refugees understand themselves as such, or did they conceptualize their situation rather as a continuation of exile, dispersion, diaspora, etc., but not a radical change in status, becoming stateless, homeless, that the term refugee indicates today?
Yes. I wouldn't really characterize it as double diaspora. I don't think that's what happens because of the way it plays out. One of the important parts of the book is the end of the crisis, what happens, in which Jews reconstruct for themselves new lives in new situations. And they always retain a sense, because of the trauma, I think, that they were refugees and they come from elsewhere. But they don't, except for the refugees from Vilna, who have a very, very strong Vilna identity. And that lasts for at least 100 years. But they very much are looking at either going home and reconstructing or integrating in where they are. They don't remain in big numbers in the Ottoman Empire, which is possibly where you might have seen this phenomenon develop. But in fact, they mostly prefer to go home, except the women. Going back from the Ottoman Empire to Eastern Europe for women was problematic in all kinds of ways. Because it was very dangerous, and more so for women, obviously. Second of all, you were likely to get a very hostile reception back home as a Jewish woman, since you would be under suspicion of conversion, sleeping with the enemy and so on. And in halachic terms, that could put you in terribly isolated situations, which was just much better probably to stay where you were and either get a divorce or prove your husband's death one way or another. So Jewish women, I think, did tend to stay in the Ottoman Empire, but the men went home. But no real Ashkenazic communities created there after, I think, about 1660s. Jerusalem is the only place that has one, but that's a whole different set of regions. Refugee status. Well, it's interesting. The Jews are never status. They're never stateless or homeless. They're not stateless because they don't have a state, right? They are not in the place where they came from. But the way in which the Jewish world, particularly in Northern Europe, dealt with the crisis seems to have been not of treating the Jews as a strange and foreign group who've arrived. You do see that in a couple of places, but mostly not. Mostly what you see is the local community opening its doors to them, finding them places to live, and helping them find a job, having them work to support themselves, or for obvious financial reasons. Much better to have the Jews support themselves. So unlike refugee crisis today, where refugees are made basically passive agents, right? They're put in camps and they're given what they need. That wasn't how it was done. And by the way, I think it's something that forced migration policy would do well to think about. I don't know how you could do it with the large numbers that we have. But this idea that the Jews always retained their agency, always. And so they could take control of their lives, and they could either make staying was a conscious decision and going back was a conscious decision. Right? And it was thought about and it was considered, and on the basis of whatever the decision was, that was what happened. And so you don't get that sense of statelessness or homelessness. Yeah, I've got to leave it there. Now, maybe in terms of memory, another thing that the Jews do is create workable memory of what happened. So in Eastern Europe, they have a special day of mourning, the 20th of Sivan, where communities come together to remember what happened in 1648 and after. In Central Europe, they don't have a special day, but they use the two usual Jewish days of mourning, Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, to remember what happened, among other things, to the Jews of Eastern Europe. And by doing that, they integrate their own personal experience into a longer continuum of Jewish suffering. One thing, that's a form of integration. One lovely place I saw that Polish Jews in Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, tried to write a new verse from Mao's Tzur, which is the Hanukkah hymn, which goes through all the ways in which God has saved the Jews. And they tried to make a new verse, right, for 1648. And obviously it didn't catch on. But it's this idea of trying to integrate that very individual experience into a much broader continuum of Jewish history, which once again is a very stabilizing and comforting thing.
We have next a question from Anat Vaturi, who's asking, from the economic perspective, did the ransom procedures improved banking / financial operations and perhaps gave Jews advantage in the economic world?
That's a really good question, Anat, really. I'm not sure that new systems of banking developed as a result of what was going on. What happened was that the systems that were in place were used much more intensively. And once again, see, I would suggest that it isn't the ransoming itself that gives the Jews the advantage. It's the transregional framework, which is expressed in the ransoming, which gives the Jews their economic advantage. The ability to do trade over much longer distances, or very long distances, transferring money, not in sophisticated ways, but in effective ways, over long distances. That underpinned the Jews' economic activity and certainly made them competitive in the economic world. Not necessarily sure they were in always the very top level, but they were always competitive. So I think I'd look at it in that way, as these being two sides of the same coin rather than different.
The next question is for both of you, and it's from Federica Francesconi. Following on Flora's line of question, in his book, Nick argues that communities of refugees constituted new communities that adhere to the same principles of exclusiveness, purification, and purgation that had characterized the communities within which they had been marginalized or from which they had been rejected. Adam, it seems to me that from your comments, your portrayal of Polish Jews after 1648 incorporate some of those elements. I mean, in terms of exclusiveness post-trauma. And so I would be curious to know more, Adam, as well as Nick's opinions on that, also in terms of a comparative perspective.
You want to say something, Nick? I've talked a lot. Oh, I can start, doesn't matter.
Yeah, but this is your session.
All right, okay, then I'll talk. I can talk. Just press the button. I can go on talking for hours. It's hard to stop me. I don't think that what's created after 1648 are separate communities of refugees. This, I don't think, is what happens. As I say, the Jews are looking at integration. They're looking at creating new lives. There is a certain, I mean, they are connected by trauma. I'm not PTSD kind of trauma, a lower level of trauma, right? You can't deal with pathologies over 300 years back, it doesn't work. So they are connected by that, and they have the moments of connection. So the past days, the 20th century in Eastern Europe. But I don't see separate communities, exclusive communities of that sort being created. No, I don't think that's how it played out. And I don't think that they're marginalized either. What's really remarkable is, certainly if you look in the rabbinic world, that the rabbis who've been forced to flee, and a lot of them end up initially in Moravia, but then they spread out across Germany, and they create the next elite of the rabbinic world in Central Eastern Europe. And what follows is this really amazing transregional rabbinate, where you're not a rabbi from a place, you can be a rabbi from anywhere, you just move around depending where you can find a contract. I argue in the book that actually plays to the advantage of Polish Jewish religious culture. And it's a stage in the Polonization of Northern European Judaism, which will only come to an end in the 19th century with the religious changes that happened to German Jewry. But what 1648 brings is an enormous Polish influence on the rabbinic world and rabbinic life, and this kind of transregional rabbinate. I think that's where I would take that question.
Adam, thank you. Actually, I think you answered to my question very well. It's just that actually I was exactly meaning what you were explaining. So not a new kind of community, but some elements of exclusiveness that in the way they were elaborated within those communities resemble a little bit what Nick is explaining in his book. But thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would say for my part that the kinds of groups that for which that kind of separate identity becomes most, in a sense, most permanent or strongest over periods of generations are often the ones more on the Calvinist or radical side, which often self-consciously compare themselves or model themselves on the Jews, and that's part of the irony or the paradox. And so when they travel, we see this in Huguenot communities, say, that go into Berlin or to the Netherlands. It's sometimes up to 3 generations before they really start to assimilate. And in that time period, they very self-consciously take on the identity of, in a sense, the chosen people, using the tropes out of the Old Testament, of the Jewish Bible, and working this into their preaching, all the rest, and also having the same kind of focus on preservation of language and often domestic rituals, so that the role of women in the preservation of the community of faith becomes very important. And it's at about the third or fourth generation that they really start to assimilate, and then gradually move over. But it's not the same experience across all the Protestant groups, and then Catholic groups will be distinct again. So it is, but this is why I think it has a greater role in the formation of the identity of these groups than is often, say, understood, or at least until recently. Some of the work that's coming out in the last 10 years really integrates that more into the experience of different Protestant and Catholic groups than it did before. And what's interesting to me is how much it's an adaptation or an invention of tradition for Protestants that builds on the Jewish experience. What I'm curious about is how much of that is conscious and how much of that is simply they're reading their scriptures and then, in a sense, taking things without really acknowledging what that means for their relations with Jews in contemporary Europe.
Perhaps I'll add something into that. There's a question that I got by email just before we started, and it's the Polish refugees actually played a key role in the formation of Jewish identity amongst the Sephardic Jews, particularly the Jews of Amsterdam, who were almost for the first time forced to consider their relationship with Jews of another ethnic background. They were, as returned conversos, part of the nation, right? Their immediate identification was likely to be with their own group, one way or another. And suddenly the Ashkenazic, the Polish Jews are turning up, and they need help, and they need money, and they need to be supported. And the Sephardic Jews really have to make a conscious decision that, yes, this is our problem, and that we are part of a broader Jewish world beyond our own ethnic boundaries. What I was asked about in the email was Menashe ben Yisrael, who goes to London in 1654 to try to get the Jews readmitted. And of course, he's interested in getting the Sephardic Jews readmitted, particularly after what's been happening in Recife and so on. But he learns about what happens to the Polish Jews from an emissary who turns up in Amsterdam, writes it down, and when he goes to London, he uses that as part of his argument, trying to speak to Christian millenarians who understand Jewish suffering as previsaging the return of the Messiah. But in this moment, which is, of a Sephardic rabbi trying to get Sephardic Jews reintegrated into London, he also, right, is bringing the Polish Jewish experience into play and using it. Right, that's not what he's about. He's not interested. He's not majorly interested in saving Polish Jews, but he is. They're part of his consciousness. They're part of the Jewish world that he is describing and he is, using. So that is a big change that does happen. But once again, I think it's more change of integration than exclusiveness.
I'm going to ask another. Oh no, there's a question here. Okay, there's a question by Arseny Agroskin. You've mentioned that the 1648 crisis and the following encounter of Jews of the Holy Roman Empire with East European refugees was an important milestone in creating German Jewish identity as opposed to Eastern European Jewry. You've also mentioned that during that time, Germany began to replace Eastern Europe as a major Jewish center. Do you see the gradual rise of Germany as a new Jewish center as stemming from the decline of all the four centers, Amsterdam, Venice, Eastern Europe, and Istanbul, and not Eastern Europe only?
Wow, that is a really brilliant question. Basically, I would say yes. What happens as the early modern period goes on and moves into the modern period, the whole structure of Europe and how Europe works and how Europe envisages itself changes. And the cultural structure of Europe changes with the Enlightenment and so on. And so, yes, these other Jewish centers go into decline. Yeah, so the answer is yes, but I'm not sure I would make that the key factor. I think there are broader factors at work that are helping this happen. When I was talking about, give me a moment, I've got to think about this, because the question of the relationship between Eastern and Western Europe is a key one. But actually, I wonder whether decline is the right word to talk about it. I was talking about the balance of power. I was talking about the creation of center and periphery, if you like. That when it came to the Jewish religious study until 1650, even a bit afterwards, Eastern Europe was the major place with where, we have wonderful letters from students in yeshivot writing home from Poland, trying to get themselves married to Polish Jewish girls and so on. When you get to the 1660s, these Polish communities are writing desperately to the German communities and further afield, for that matter, asking for money. And we can't survive without donations. I was thinking more in terms of a mental shift, I think, than an actual physical decline. Eastern Europe, strangely enough, doesn't decline in the sense that you're talking about. We used to think that following the traumas of 1648 and what that meant for Poland and Lithuania, the Jews went in this long period of decline that would bring eventually Frankism and Hasidism, and Poland would go towards a partition. I think more recent research has suggested that that is not actually a clear, the most clear picture of what happened. That it's not one long, slow decline. That there are sectors of Eastern Europe, the Eastern European economy and Eastern European Jewish life that don't decline. What I've worked on is the magnate economy, for example. It doesn't decline. It flourishes. It flourishes at the expense of a centralized economy as develops in Central and Western Europe, which eventually will spell disaster for Poland. But it doesn't spell disaster for Poland in 1648, right? But 100 years later. So I'm thinking much less about the physical decline and more in a sense of self-vision, of the way Ashkenazic Jews saw themselves. I think that changes, and I think that's what I was interested in.
Do we have any other questions? I was fascinated by all the connections that you've been drawing in terms of, your answer to the question about Manasseh in Israel and the connections between Sephardic networks and Eastern European networks. And I wonder, I guess I've been thinking throughout this conversation about the two big dates that early modernists think about, 1492 and 1648, and how they resonate in Jewish memory. And I was intrigued by your suggestion that Sephardic Jews themselves don't necessarily think about 1492 in 1648, but they're influenced by 1648 itself. So the event of 1648 ends up having a resonance in the notion of diaspora and how to build community rather than the long-term memory of the expulsion. Am I just fantasizing, or is this something?
No, you're not fantasizing. I think what I was trying to say about 1648 is less that the notion of 1648 and more the challenge of 1648. It wasn't thinking about it, that it was having to deal with it, having to make the conscious decision to deal with it. And for example, it didn't happen in every field. It took a while for this to percolate right through, because in raising money for the Jews in the Holy Land, there were still separate ethnic fundraising systems, Ashkenazic and Sephardic, well past 1648, into the 18th century. So it doesn't something that happens everywhere, but it is a moment at which this very relatively young community in Amsterdam has to think about itself and make a decision. Are we going to put money in this direction? And they put, relatively speaking, a lot of money in that direction. There's another date we haven't mentioned, which is very important in Jewish history. Of course, that's 1665, 1666, which is also part of the story, but perhaps we've got a question, so I'll keep that for a minute.
There's a question from David Brodsky. You mentioned the role you see your book playing in culture today. Related to that, my knowledge of Ukrainian education today is the Khmelnytsky is thought as the great, Khmelnytsky is thought as the great hero at the founding of the national identity. Is there a role academics should play in dialoguing with Ukrainian educators?
In a word, yes. And in 2 words, yes, definitely. In fact, it's happening. Academic Ukrainian Jewish dialogue is something that's been on the cards and is happening and is gathering force in the last decade, even slightly more. I presented my section on what happened in the Khmelnytsky uprising to the Ukrainian Research Center in Harvard and was stunned by how significant they felt this moment was in understanding that aspect of their history, which they've only ever seen through the prism of nation building. Understanding it in rather broader terms of the societies that were, that are developing in Ukraine and what this meant for all of them, and the choice of the Jews to return to Ukraine. They were really fascinated by that. There's one other thing that my research threw up, which I haven't looked at in depth, but it was kind of popped up along the way with my sources. So we tend to think of 1648 as also the Ukrainians uprising and under Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who was the leader of the Cossack forces, and killing all the Jews because they hated the Poles. Very often we just think they killed all the Jews because they hated the Jews. Anyway, my research suggested, first of all, that Bogdan Khmelnytsky, though hostile to the Jews, was by no means the sworn enemy of the Jews. That was much more the peasants who joined the rebellion a bit later on. But even more than that, I began to find evidence of sectors of Ukrainian society, not sectors, people, individuals, who not only did not take part in the violence, but were actively trying to help Jews. Trying, to save them from death and destruction, give them succor as they fled from place to place, which is not in the historical record at all, as far as I can make out. I've never seen it mentioned anywhere. And I think that's another of the phenomena that I would hope that someone would, light the imagination of someone reading my book, and they can go and do the kind of research that needs to be done. Because that is, the Jews and the Ukrainians lived together in very close quarters for a century or more. And surely there's religious tension and religious hatred and ethnic hatred and economic tension and hatred. Surely there are all those things, but there are other things at work too. There's personal connections, there are individual connections. There's just basic, human or religious responses to tragedy. And rather than sort of looking at this as Ukrainians against the Jews, Ukrainian nationalism against Jewish nationalism, I think there's a moment that's coming to try to look at that in a rather more nuanced way. Certainly we know that there were East European Jews who were sympathetic to the plight of the Ukrainian peasants, who were being brutally exploited by the Polonized Catholic nobility. And we do have evidence of Jews, and Nick, this might interest you, the Jews say, this is like Egypt, only we are in the place of, because we work for the nobles, we're in the place of the Egyptians, and it's the Ukrainian peasants who are the children of Israel. Right? That's an amazing turnaround. Right? So that's not a dominant voice, but it's a voice that you can hear. So I think this is a call. There is this is actually, one of the things that my book would spark that. I'd be absolutely delighted.
Are there any final questions for Adam or for Nick?
I'm just going to say one thing to finish, just because I'd like to say, and that is another of the things that my book threw up, and it's not surprising, the question of gender relations, the role of women, the sufferings of women during the crisis and some of the responses of the women to that suffering. It's really very interesting. We talked about this as dual diaspora. Women were in a dual bind during the period I'm describing, both as Jews and as women, but then as refugees and refugee women. And as I said, the question of going home to an enormous burden of suspicion and difficulty in reintegrating themselves into their families, let alone society. The question of the evidentiary standard for proving that you were a widow. What I discovered was that the women who'd been captured and sent to the Ottoman Empire, they seemed to have developed a kind of information network whereby any time somebody found a person with news from Eastern Europe, they would be brought about some husband, they would be brought to court and deposed, and then the record would be kept, so that the women, it seems to me, it's hard to prove this, but the amount of sources is such that it seems to me that this is deliberate. There's an information network being created. So if you're a rabbi in Jerusalem with a woman, you can write to somewhere else and say, do you have information? We've heard that there might be information about her where you are. And if the deposition's been taken, then that can be sent. That's really interesting. That's women taking a slightly proactive stance to what's happening. I found one wonderful case about women in Cairo who had heard their husbands were still alive. And so they wanted to get divorces because you either have to prove your husband's dead or you get a divorce. And so they sent an emissary from Cairo to Eastern Europe during the war with instructions to find their husbands and get divorces from them and come back, which he did. I mean, it's quite remarkable. I mean, God knows how he did it. But he came back with 4 divorce documents for these women, which of course were brought to the rabbinic court. And of course, the rabbi was entirely suspicious of the whole thing. So even something of that sort, women were struggling. The very nicest thing I found is not directly connected to the refugee crisis, but indirectly. Polish Jews before the crisis had raised lots of money for the land of Israel, which dried up when the war started. And there was a terrible crisis of funding for the Jews of Jerusalem. They ran out of money because the source they'd been used to was gone. And people were dying of starvation. And the Jewish women in Jerusalem were entirely fed up because the men were taking all of the money that was being donated to the Holy Land and using it for good reason. They had a problem with the non-Jewish authorities and they had to pay them off. They didn't leave any money for the widows who were dying from starvation. And so they also hired an emissary, Shmuel Levy from Frankfurt, if my memory serves. They wrote a letter in Yiddish addressed to the Jewish women of Germany and said, please donate money to Jerusalem and make sure that you note that it's for the Jewish women of Jerusalem so that the men can't take this because we're dying. And if you do that, we'll pray for you the Western Wall, we'll pray for you the Cave of Machpelah, whatever. And it's a wonderful, also another moment where Jewish women take agency. They try to create their own philanthropic network. It doesn't come to anything, right? It's still a patriarchal society, right? The options are very, very limited. But just the very fact that this happened, once again, is showing that women have their own experience and they have to overcome a lot of suspicion and just being ignored by male society. And that's another sort of thing which my research throughout piecemeal. I don't have enough huge amount of sources, but piecemeal, you get this picture of Jewish women responding actively as far as they can to their situation.
We only have 5 minutes left, but there is a final question in the chat, again, from Arseni Agroskin, who is wondering about other studies that have taken a transnational approach. Going beyond studying local Jewish centers separately, and is also wondering about which other possible fields beyond the Pidyon Shvuim you could think of where looking at intercommunal interactions would be fruitful. And I guess Jordan didn't have a question. She just needed to go.
Thank you, Jordan. Anyway, nice comment. Yes, yes. There are many. Well, there are some aspects in which it's been researched. The most famously, of course, it's the converso world, the Sephardic world, the huge economic network sketched out by Jonathan. Sketched out is a huge book by Jonathan Israel in his book. There's a wonderful, more detailed study on the economic aspects by Francesca Privolato, but there's a whole range of literature. I see Jessica Reutman's here. She's also written about it. So the whole range of literature about that, that's a very important. And I think that was one of the things that really sparked thinking about this. In the more modern period, Lisa Leff wrote a book about the Alliance and its transregional aspects. Sarah Brevier-Stein wrote a lovely little book called Plumes about the economic networks of the late 19th century. So there are, you know, the work has been done. It's we haven't reached a critical mass. Oh, Matthias Lehmann's book. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, of course. Okay.
I want to thank you all. Thank you so much, Adam and Nick. This was such a stimulating session. If any of you missed the beginning, it's been recorded and it will be uploaded later on to the center's YouTube page. Again, thank you all for so much food for thought. This was truly wonderful. I again want to remind you all that you can get a 30% discount on Adam's book. Thank you so much. Rescue the Surviving Souls, the great Jewish refugee crisis of the 17th century, by using the code ATELL, A-T-E-L-L, all caps, if you buy it from Princeton University Press. Thank you again, Adam.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you, Nick. It was wonderful. I had a great time.
And thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Francesca. It's been a great time, great conversation.
Thank you all for coming.